Malo ni everyone, this is another Pacifica Success Guide, and in this one I'm going to walk you through some general exam skills. Specifically, I'm going to walk you through how you should prepare for exams and tests. That means planning studies and also study techniques, and also what you should be doing on exam day. So that means answering questions and also time management as well. So step one, you want to make sure that you're finding information about your tests and exams before you actually get to exam periods. Now, you've probably already done this, but just keep in mind that you need to check all the resources your instructors have provided for you. You don't want to go into the exam without actually knowing what's going to be examinable if your instructor has already told you this. For example, in Hamster 101, the instructor has told the students all the relevant learning outcomes that will be in the exam, so they know what to study and not to study too much. Also, you can look at past exam papers to give you a hint of what will be in the exams, but keep in mind that exams change over time. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes it's best to study things that are relevant to the course, obviously, but also look particularly at material that's closer to the end of the semester, so that's more recent in time. Now let's focus on scheduling your study leading up to your exams. So for example, if I have an exam that's at 2 p.m., my first exam is at 2 p.m. on the 5th of November. And then I also have my second exam that's at 2 p.m. on the 9th of November. One way that I might actually schedule my study is like this. So I will spend the first 4 days of studying specifically for exam number 1. So that might be Hamster 101 or EdProf or something like that. And then once that's done, then I will just focus solely on exam number 2 at 2 p.m. on the 9th of November. Other times you might feel a bit less confident about exam number 2. So maybe in that paper, you find that material has been harder or you haven't had as much time to look at that material. Then in that case, you might actually have an extra study of studying for exam number 2 on the 1st of November, as you can see in the top left, before you really get stuck into the study for exam number 1 in green. And then after exam number 1 is finished, you can get stuck back into studying for exam number 2. Here's another scenario. You might have an exam number 1 at 2 p.m. on the 11th of November. And if you're unlucky, you might actually have an exam the very next day in the morning. This does happen to people sometimes. Let's just call that exam number 2. Now, how are you going to study for this, or how are you going to schedule your study? Well, I recommend simply just alternating study on a day-to-day basis. Okay, that means that on a single day, you can focus on one course and that can keep things focused for that day. And just to make sure you're keeping it with both courses, you're actually alternating. So on the next day, you'll be studying for the other course and then back to the alternative course and so on and so forth. You can also see in the schedule that there is actually a day of rest that's been actually scheduled there. And that's just to make sure you keep sane, because most people can't keep an intense level of study consistent for that amount of time leading up to the exams. You might actually prefer doing other kinds of planning, that's fine, but the key is to do some kind of planning. It really does make a lot of difference. Now, once you've got your study plan sorted out, let's look at some study techniques. Now, here are some useful study techniques that we will cover very quickly: SQ3R, the Pomodoro technique, mind maps, and then flashcards. Let's start off with SQ3R. It's an active reading strategy, and it stands for survey, question, read, recite, and recall. This is best for when you want to engage in deep reading and understanding of a text. That means a textbook chapter or something in a book or a journal article or something like that. So this is actually the most efficient way to do it. Sometimes we just go straight into a reading, like a chapter, and just read it from start to finish and hope to remember all the information. And usually that doesn't work. So if you use SQ3R, you're much more likely to recall all that important information. This can take time, so it's not really ideal for a last-minute study cramming. I would actually recommend that you try to do this throughout the semester if you can, or if you have a week or a bit more time to actually go through the readings before you have your exams. Okay, and like I said, it's good for textbook chapters and journal articles. The next is the Pomodoro technique. It means tomato in Italian. So it's good for almost any kind of study, like an assignment or an exam. And it's really good for when you are easily distracted. So it's actually something that keeps you on task. If you want to be as productive as possible, I recommend doing something like this. And it's also useful when you have a limited amount of time, like you often do with exams. So you want to make sure you make the most of like your 2 or 3 days before your exam. How does it work? What you need is a timer. Any timing device will do, maybe a stopwatch or your phone, and also a task to complete, like an assignment or a reading. And what you want to do is you actually want to break down that task into sub goals. So, like, certain different things you need to complete in order to complete the whole goal. And then you choose the task and you actually set the timer for 25 minutes. And during that time, what you're going to do is work only on that task until the time buzzes. So you're going to have 25 minutes of continuous work and then take a 5-minute break and then repeat the whole process. So here's just an example of how that might look. You might do your first tomato, where you find 3 articles for your assignment. So that's actually a subtask. You spend 25 minutes doing that, take a 5-minute break, do whatever you want. And the second one, you'll actually read and take notes on 1 article for another 25 minutes, and that's then another 5-minute break, and then so on and so forth for the remaining articles. The next one is mind mapping. Mind mapping just involves making some kind of diagram for ideas or concepts or images linked around some kind of central concept. So it's often really useful to do during lectures or presentations, and just making sure that you're actually staying engaged with the content. So a lot of you will be looking at lecture recordings in your preparations for exams. If you want to make sure you're actively listening, then a good thing to do is actually to use these mind maps. So here's an example of what one might look like. You might write down a main topic, so a core concept, in the center of a page, and then also add keywords linking off or branching off from that core concept. And again, that just means that you're actually mapping these things to your brain and making it easier for you to remember these things and how all these different ideas are connected. Lastly is one of my favorite, it is flashcards. So it's really perfect for when you need to quickly memorize things. This is really important for a lot of you first year students who have a large volume of things to remember. So if you have 5 days to memorize something, I often recommend that you spend 3 days making flashcards and then 2 days actually looking at them. So you actually spend more time making flashcards than looking at them. And that's also because the act of making flashcards is also really useful for studying in and of itself. And then you really quickly memorize them with the flashcards. So now we're going to go to what you want to do on exam day. Now let's look at planning for exam day. So you want to make sure you know where your exam is, and that way you can actually plan out your commute to the exam location. I recommend getting there early, maybe about half an hour early if you can. And also clear your schedule leading up to the exam. That's obviously on the day and maybe the day before, so you can make sure you get the amount of rest you need. And here's an important piece of advice. Always get a full night's sleep. That's really important. And never pull an all-nighter. All-nighter being staying up all night studying. Never do that the night before your exam. Some people think that's a good idea because they think, oh, I can just study more and learn more and I'll do better in the exam. But what happens is that you'll end up going to the exam, you will be fatigued and your brain will move slower and you won't perform as well. So do not pull an all-nighter. I really mean it. What to bring to the exam: an ID card, pens, pencils, other writing tools, extra clothes to make sure you're always at a comfortable temperature to make sure you don't affect your performance, and also a drinking water in a clear bottle. Make sure you don't drink too much, of course, because that's also going to affect your ability to do the exam. Now let's talk about answering questions in your exam. So some strategies and things to keep in mind when you're doing that. Get into that, let's just quickly talk about caffeine. So caffeine will make sure that you stay alert during your exam. Most of us use caffeine in some way or another. Now, a lot of us fall into the trap of actually drinking more caffeine than you normally would drink in the morning of your exam or on the morning of your exam. Okay, and the idea is that you're going to be more awake, so you're going to perform better. I do not recommend doing this. So an excess of caffeine beyond what you're used to is actually probably going to reduce your performance, not improve it. You might get the jitters. You might actually be a bit too hyped up, and that's not going to allow you to actually, perform as you normally would on the day. You want to actually be fairly normal as you have been consistently leading up to the exam. So the best thing you can do for your exam is to study, obviously, and also get a full night of sleep on the night before and have the normal amount of caffeine that you normally would have in the morning of your exam. Once you are in the exam room, make sure your ID card is on your desk. Then normally you'll be given reading time. Make sure to use it and read all the questions that you can. And while you're reading those questions, take note of any ideas that come to mind, okay? That might help you plan or think about what you're gonna answer the questions with once you can start writing. And then finally, plan your time if you can. How much time do you want to spend on each section? Sometimes you're told what sections are in your exam before you go into the exam room, and how much each section is worth. So sometimes you can actually plan your timing before you even step inside of the exam room. Let's talk about exam strategy. First, we have multi-choice questions. So obviously you need to pay attention to the questions. You need to do this with any kind of question, but with multi-choice questions, make sure you read all of the options before answering. So look at every option, usually there's 4 of them, and then decide rather than just choosing straight away when you first see something that looks like it's correct. Note any qualifying words, that things like choose the most correct answer, or which does not, or choose the one that is least likely or something like that. So make sure you look at the wording of the question. When you're choosing your answers, make sure to find the obvious correct answers first and exclude them. So sometimes you might not know, what the answer might be. You can actually narrow down the list of possible answers by making sure to cross out the ones that are obviously incorrect. Okay, always give an answer to an MCQ. There is no reason to actually leave an MCQ blank, okay? Because if you just guess, you have a 25% chance, assuming that there's 4 options, of getting the right answer. So always give some kind of answer. If you have no idea, then just guess. Okay, and also try your best to leave enough time to actually check your MCQs in your exam. So hopefully you'll have time at the end to review all the answers you've given and have a second think about them. Here's an example. Savage Mode 2 is in an album from which artist? If you want to use some of these techniques, one thing you do is, first of all, you'd probably cross off Taylor Swift. It's unlikely that Taylor Swift would release an album called Savage Mode 2, so you can cross that option out. And that means you only need to select from 3 options rather than 4. Let's quickly go through short answer questions. So you want to analyze the question. That means identifying the keywords and phrases that the marker might be expecting that should give you a hint of the kind of information you need to include, like from which module or which textbook chapters and so on and so forth. Consider how many marks the short answer is actually worth. So if it's worth more, then sometimes you might need to write more. So if you're wondering how much to write, keep an eye on how many marks it's worth. Also look at how much space you have to write the short answers. Sometimes this isn't relevant if you're using standard exam paper. And it's also sometimes useful to spend a bit of time planning the question if you actually have time to do so. And also, it's useful to use the teal structure, maybe minus the L. So just a topic sentence, explanation, and example. A topic sentence being a statement about what your answer to the question is, and then an explanation of that topic sentence, and then an example. And what that does is can really lock in your understanding to the marker. I recommend you don't spend any time rewriting a question. I sometimes see people do this. So they get to a question and they rewrite the entire question before giving their actual answer. And that's a complete waste of time. You don't need to do that at all. And also keep to the point, leave out the waffle. Waffle being any unnecessary words or explanations. Sometimes people think that if they write more, they're going to get better marks. That isn't always the case. Use your time wisely and write only what you need to write. This brings us to essay questions. So essay questions can be some of the most difficult to answer, but let's just go through how you might want to tackle these. So when you are given the reading time at the start of the exam, often then you want to actually choose which essay questions you want to answer if you're actually given a choice. And what I recommend is that for an essay question, the first thing you do in an exam with an essay question in it is at the very start of the exam, then you start making notes and planning out of how you're actually going to answer the essay. The reason why is that when you first step into an exam and right at the start, your mind is most fresh and you're most able to kind of regurgitate all that stuff that you've been memorizing in the past. As the exam goes on, you're going to get fatigued and it's going to be harder to do that. So I recommend starting to make notes and planning your essay at the very start of the exam if you can. And then read all the options before deciding on which essay question to answer. Okay, so that's something you should also be doing at the start. And when you're answering multiple essay questions, start with the questions that you know best. Again, you want to be putting most of your time into the essay questions that you feel most comfortable with. And again, just like with the short answers, you want to identify keywords, instructions, and limits that will give you a hint of what the marker will be looking for in your essay. And as I've been hinting at already, you need to plan your essay. So I've given you an example on the right-hand side of from a previous assignment guide that I've put down, but you don't actually need to have word counts in there. Word counts are less important. Really, what's the limiter for you is the amount of time you have, but it's really good to plan out what you might be putting or how your structure of your essay might be in a similar way to how we can see here. So having an introduction, what you're going to do with each paragraph, and then your conclusion as well. When should you leave the exam early? The answer to that question is probably never. It is almost always a bad idea to leave an exam early. That is, unless in the unlikely scenario that your instructor has given you way more time than you need. So you might have 3 hours to do something that actually takes 2 hours. That is almost never the case, okay? If you want to leave an exam early, make sure you do the following, okay? Make sure you do this consistently. Revise all of your answers. Check for any areas where you can write more to increase the quality of your answer. This might be with short answers or essay questions. So there might be parts where you can actually insert something in and actually write more and get a better mark possibly. Then you want to revise all your answers again. And once you're done with that, finally, you can revise your answers again. Okay, and really you should just be revising your answers as much as you can before that final countdown and with the end of the amount of time that's been given you to do the exam. Okay, it's almost never a good idea to leave the exam early. I really mean it. All right, you've answered all the questions, you've stayed for the full amount of time, you revised them, you handed it in, you walked out the door, you're all done, and now you can relax. That is, unless you actually have more exams to do. Thank you so much for listening to this guide, the Pacifica Success Guide, and I'll see you in another video.